Okay, thanks everyone for coming, and we're really happy to have two of the artists from the show tonight. Destroyed by Shadows, talking to Dr. Donal Moloney from Fine Art at Liverpool Hope. And this exhibition I know has been a year in the planning, and it's really worth it. You should have just been over to the private view. It's amazing. We're really pleased with it. So, without further ado, welcome our speakers. Thank you.
Hi everyone, can you hear me? Yeah? Ish? Okay, good. So I'm Donal. So I'm the course coordinator here in Fine Art Liverpool Hope. I just want to introduce Michael Stubbs to my left and John Bunker to my right. Just a little bit of bio so you have some sort of idea of where they're coming from. So John Bunker is based in London, studied art and social context at Dartington College in '91. John is also a writer and regularly has work published in the online painting forum Abstract Critical, which is really worth keeping an eye on. It's a really, really great resource. Bunker infuses the remnants of our urban hinterlands in his work with the visual charge unique to modernist art. So the results are absurd yet poised, brutal and strangely elegant. And John is a fiercely independent artist. It says here that he works without a gallery, but John's collages have entered private collections alongside work by artists including Gillian Ayres, George Brack, Alan Davey, Robin Denny, John McLean and John Hoyland. Just some background on Michael Stubbs. He's also based in London, studied fine art at Bath Academy of Art and also at Goldsmiths, completing his PhD in 2003. And he's a lecturer in painting and print at Glasgow School of Art. Michael's paintings operate at the interface of abstraction and pop. They're constructed by combining poured abstract figurations of transparent varnishes and opaque household paints with ready-made graphic stencils. The repeated pouring in conjunction with the pop signs form a physical process of sensual flat-on-flat layering that reveals multiple perspectives and optical depths. And I think you'll see from the works over there, that's a pretty solid description of both John and Michael's work. Recent shows that Michael Stubbs has been in a solo exhibition here at the Cornerstone Gallery last year. So that was a solo exhibition. Also exhibitions include From Council at Bloomsbury in 2015 in London, Hollenbach Gallery in Stuttgart in 2015, The Avenue in Mayfair in London in 2014, and Cass Gallery at London Metropolitan University in 2013. Okay, so that's just some some background. So we're going to have a chat about the show, and I think quite a bit about abstract painting and its sort of its status and its taking the temperature of abstract painting today. And then we're going to open it up to some questions. Okay, so there's probably going to be a roving mic going around. But just to start off, I wanted to ask you, John, just about the sort of the impetus to the show, the idea destroyed by shadows, about the kind of condition maybe of abstract painting today. I wonder if you could elaborate a bit on sort of the impetus for the show and this thematic.
Yeah, I think for me this is entwined a lot with the dialogue that me and Mike have been involved in for the last few years. I saw the show at Cass before I knew Mike, and I was instantly impressed with the quality of the work and what I felt was going on in the work. I felt a natural affinity to that. And after that, I wrote a review of that show, and then I started to interview Michael, which is all available on Abstract Critical to look at. And through that process, I found that we had a strong affinity with certain ideas about abstraction and what had happened to abstraction really since the 60s, and how our notions of the history of modern art, I guess, were wrapped up with the history of abstraction. So this show really is an ongoing part of our process and our dialogue. I'd see it like that. We had a show together recently at the ASC gallery where I have a gallery space which I use with other people who, other artists who share studios in London. And it's a really exciting space to operate in because, as we all know, it's becoming harder and harder to find spaces to make challenging and experimental exhibitions in London. So then again, we were able to then, I guess, move our dialogue on in showing together and then bringing other artists on board as we saw fit. So the last show we did together was called Unnatural Vibers, which is a play on, obviously, on natural fibres. So, I mean, that again, you can see, I guess, the qualities that we were trying to explore in that process. So this show is, for us, I think, an even more, I guess, what was the word, a more challenging idea of bringing even more artists into the mix who we both felt were connected in some way with this idea about where abstract painting had gone in the last, say, 30 years or so. So that was the basis. That's where it comes from, where I guess the dynamic push for the show comes from.
I mean, when I was reading the press release and, shows about abstract painting, I'm always curious to know this idea of it continuing or replenishing itself. And what I took out of the press release and what I thought was really fascinating was the idea of abstract painting and of the idea of it being almost impure, or that this 1960s notion of this Greenbergian thing that I'm sure will come up again, this idea of delimiting paint to doing exactly what it's best at doing, being super flat on the surface, and not telescoping out to anything else in the outside world. And that to continue in abstract painting now, it's quite, artists have kind of realized there is no kind of purity, and actually the impurity can be quite, it can be something to kind of work with. Is that kind of part of the thinking that, in terms of maybe selecting artists or kind of developing the show, Michael?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I think that's right. And in terms like purity seem somehow questionable, problematic. I mean, there seems to be a kind of central idea that somehow, as you said with Greenberg, that the materiality operates in and of itself, that the carrier of meaning is material, and that material has to reference the flat plane. This was Greenberg's so-called big breakthrough in the 1940s, in fact. But what we're trying to do, I mean, I think most artists in the world who are working around abstraction are very aware of the kind of predominance of this theory, or the ex-predominance of this theory. But it's a very useful starting point, not just to kind of kick against, but to actually try and think about reworking. And so the term impurity, I see it rather than being a polemic or a binary to purity, that it somehow opens up or allows a dialogue for, as you say, the external, the extraneous to what is supposed to be modernist painting. So, for example, you can put, it's quoted in here, non-art materials in the paintings, digital representations, the body's performative actions, which are left as visible, or not if you make a flat painting, but that's something else. So I think social histories, social references, pop culture, these are all things that can be very much integrated into the language. Yeah. And I think that gives painting right now a huge freedom.
Remember, it was, I think, Martin Herbert, he was writing about Marlene Dumas, who I know isn't necessarily an abstract painter, but some of her paintings, early paintings especially, teeter on that edge, things with sellotape and things like that. And he talked about her paintings being like, almost like projection screens, when they became almost totally diffuse. And I loved that idea, almost thinking about like perhaps the monochrome or some abstract paintings as being like this kind of projection screen. Just something that kind of came to mind there when you were talking about that. Like, what kind of things do you think some particular works in the show that they do, this idea of kind of maybe them being like kind of satellites where they might be beaming out information but also receiving, or maybe like radios or something. What kind of things do you think they might be bringing in? I'm just trying to get an idea of what this kind of, and I know you said it's not a kind of a binary, but what kind of things are abstract paintings This is a difficult question. What are things that abstract painting are saying about the world today?
No,
how it's relevant?
It's a difficult question, but it's a relevant question, but actually it's pretty simple to answer in many ways, because if you think of the visual world that's presented to us all now, usually on our phones, usually on the screen, etc., we're all very familiar with electronic technical information and visual imagery being utilized through that. So, this has only really been probably prevalent in the wider culture, perhaps for the last 25, 30 years. Prior to that, we had film and photography, but of course that's all integrated into the screen often, or the depth of the screen, as I would argue. But that's a different argument. So I think for me, and I think for a number of these artists, we cannot help but be informed visually about the world in relation to the screen, in one instance, or film and photography. At the same time, I think all these artists, although recognizing that in the arena of popular culture, also reference or are aware of the histories of painting, especially modernist and postmodernist painting.
Yeah.
And I think, you combine all those elements together and you've got a rich mix of influences or visual influences and histories and trajectories to work from. And I think one of the unique things about painting per se, is that you can, with its rich history, Western history primarily, but not exclusively, that, you go right back to medieval painting or Renaissance painting. It's so well written about, it's so public. So it's got those histories embedded within visual culture. Because, just to finish the question, if you've got you look at a Hollywood movie and you see a perfectly framed shot, for example, shot after shot, that visual thinking comes from somewhere. And I would argue it's often come from the very kind of particularity of Renaissance framing.
Yeah, absolutely. What I'd say, though, it's interesting to talk about something that isn't binary or non-binary. I still think there are channels or two distinct ways of looking at the history of painting, maybe. One is, and Greenberg, for instance, would see himself at the end of a continuum, an idea of continuity. Yeah. So there is, in some respects, he would see himself at one end of a relationship with Renaissance painting. And he was looking to find those connections. Yeah. Now, that's one version of modernist thinking about art. There's an idea as well, though, at the same time, which I think comes out of a Marxist critique of history, which is modernity under pressure, which is modernity as a series of ruptures, that there is no continuity. Okay? So I get what you're saying. I'm with that. But at the same time, I feel that there's a certain kind of painting and an attitude to painting which signifies destructive underminings of what we take for granted as the history of painting. So it's deliberately undermining those things. It's deliberately questioning those things. And that, within my work, and I guess the history of collage, it's an essential component. It's the driving force behind the original collage, the attitude of collage within the history of modern art.
And rupture, of course, could also be translated as knowing. So recognizing the languages that have gone before and reworking them. That's another form of rupture, isn't it?
Yeah,
perhaps?
Yeah, exactly. So it's not necessarily, I don't mean Marxism in terms of an ideology, I'm thinking about it in terms of a philosophical look at history and how history is obviously dominated by particular power brokers at particular times in history, and their idea of visual culture becomes powerful, becomes dominant. And then gradually, as history turns, the tide turns, one great power structure is undermined by another, and suddenly we're confronted with a new version of a visual culture.
It's no surprise, isn't it? We talked a little bit about this earlier today, about how painters have used that history not as something to be sort of, to kind of shirk away from, that actually it can be almost like material in a way, almost like a subject matter. And, there has been instances in the 80s, 90s, and up to now where you do see a kind of an ironic look at it. It's kind of like and we can go on to talk about the gesture, but it sort of made me think of this quote, because I thought it would come up, because I thought about shadows, and perhaps shadows being something about history.
Yeah.
And I came across this quote last week. Someone reposted an interview with Frank Auerbach from The Guardian, and he talks about that. I think he kind of succinctly puts it together, how painting sort of can use history, and actually perhaps it should. And he says, in painting, well, you start to realize that painting is not quite as easy as you thought. No, it isn't. In fact, what you're doing isn't really painting at all. You gradually see how much of a historical backlog there is, and if you don't take into account what you're doing, it's nothing more than fiddling about. And I think that's really, I think what he's saying there is you'd be kind of missing a trick. If the way your guys are talking about abstract painting is not this pure mix, it's like one element, this pure thing, that it can be this hodgepodge of thing. And on one level, it can appear like an abstract painting. Subsequent readings, that breaks apart in interesting ways. Does that chime at all, this Auerbach quote?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. I mean, I know Auerbach's not necessarily a precursor to a lot of these artists, or indeed part of the generation. But I think he is certainly. I think certainly that the quote suggests that there is possibility there, and I think one of the things I think helps. So I don't quite know what I'm saying here, but a sense of knowing one's history helps. Now, of course, that's very difficult when students are starting out. They think there's this big, long trajectory of art history that you must know. I don't think you kind of do, but my history is very sketchy, but every time I go to the National Gallery, I choose my favourite artists over and over again. And I learn from them as a painter, but I also recognise the historical placement. And I think we can work with that somehow. And extend this quote, because I think it's a question of context.
Exactly.
Context is what places your work as an artist in relation to other art. And what I don't mean by that is art as art. Quotational, 1980s, ironic, postmodern art, necessarily. I think that it's a recognition or a starting point, or seeing yourself as part of something which then spreads out into the world.
Yes. Yeah.
Such as seeing images, on Piccadilly Circus, on those huge, great screens they've got, which are massive, and they're completely ethereal. Not like a painting which is physical on a canvas or a board. The screen is there; it's micro thin. The image is there, but without depth. The depth is implied, but it's not physical, and that's a really interesting thing for me to think about. I'm probably extending this a little bit too far beyond the quote, but our visual world has changed dramatically since Auerbach. Alec may have said this recently, but certainly since Auerbach was looking at
I
visual
think,
world
Mike, that's
history.
a brilliant way of also bringing it back to the show and thinking about, as an artist, finding one's place in the world and how you go through that process. The curatorial process, for me, is very much about that, extending that idea, because you're looking at other artists' work, who are alive and kicking, just like you are. We are all here today, and they're all producing work in this world at this time. And part of the joy of curation for me is bringing these artworks into relation to each other, in the hope that I have to, put my hand on my heart, in the hope that I'm going to learn something from that process. Otherwise, I can't see much point in doing it. So the dynamic relationship between the artworks that we brought together will hopefully, as Mike has eloquently put, in a way, clichédly, paint some kind of picture of how it is to be making art now. What is going on? It's a way of getting a kind of a temperature.
It's also a way of, it's a temperature thing about the climate, but it's also a vehicle still of expressivity, let's be honest.
Yes.
You still want to say something about the world that you see around you. Advertising, perhaps, or something on the screen, or something you've seen on a news feed, or something you've seen in the National Gallery, or, something, so that, you say, I feel this
Yeah.
about the world, and I will express this. What language can I use?
Yeah.
And I had this really interesting conversation earlier with a group of first years, that might be here, I don't know, where we were talking about this very thing, about how we contextualize painting as that kind of activity, you know. And the question I was asked is, well, how do you react against previous generations? And I think that's a kind of avant-gardist, almost mythology.
Yeah.
You know, that it's like, you know, one fashion comes after another, comes after another. And the fashion industry love to play that game. And they love to, the art industry loves to play that game of fashion. Oh yeah, so-and-so is so last week. You know, therefore the new kid on the block is, and you know, it can be productive. But I think a look at the world and expressing oneself and finding out what makes things tick is a worthwhile activity.
Yeah.
Whether that taken up in an avant-gardist or fashion sense is another matter.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
You know the way you kind of touched on there about the idea of like of feeling, which is almost like this. Not that it's a sort of a word you don't hear that often associated with art, but if you look through press releases, the word doesn't come up. That emotion, things like that. This kind of idea of, I feel this way about, you know, the green grass or about the sunset. I'm going to make work about that, and then you have this kind of voice in the back of your kind of critical mind which goes, well, why should anyone care? Why should anyone give, you know, a hoot about that?
Yeah.
Which can kind of keep, you know, artists in check, that we're not just making, you know, work for yourself in kind of a way, that it is somehow, however kind of diluted or kind of complex is a better word, is making a reaction to the world out there. But in terms of this thing about perhaps emotion or feeling, it's got me thinking about the idea of the gesture. And I mean, thinking about abstract painting and thinking about the works in the show, you've got a real myriad of approaches to the gesture, whether it's filtered through the photographic, whether it's filtered not through painting at all, through bronze, whether it's filtered through something we associate with painting, but sort of maybe done kind of scrubbing back, so feeling kind of print made. I wonder, had that come up in conversations with both of you in terms of the gesture?
Yeah, I think so. And feeling is something that, I mean, it's a word, it was a bit of a dirty word 15, 20 years ago.
This goes back to what you were saying about irony and about...
Yeah, we have to be sort of like, hey, we're kind of feeling, oh God, no, it's so naff.
Yeah.
And it's so sort of like genuine, because originally what a lot of my generation were talking about was looking at the gestural brushmark like this, de Kooning, for example, and somehow this gesture represented raw emotion, your guts spilling out into the painting. That's how it was read. Well, we were all saying, hang on a minute, this is not true. That gesture is simply a language, or what's left of the gesture, or the trace of the gesture, is a language. And you know, you can fake that, you can go, but you don't have to feel angry. Then you might do. So it's a mythology that means anger and angst.
Yeah.
And so what you're left with is the gesture and the language that it represents. You know, that it can only be a signifier of. It's not the same as what's inside ourselves.
Yeah.
So we all kind of got very rude about this and said, yeah, we were very anti-gesture, very kind of ironic, and wouldn't use the term feeling. But I think there's a sea change, and I think the idea of feeling can come through painting regardless of whether you use a gesture or not.
I think it has really come back. I've really noticed it. The people.
But I think equally with a flat painting or an electronically produced painting or image, that reflection or that language is endemically placed within the notion of the gesture.
That is different. You see, what bugs me about this, about the idea of feeling, is that it was a catch-all. It was not authentic. This notion of authenticity, that because I decide to go like that, it means something because I did it. That was not good enough anymore. It had to stop.
It had to be questioned.
It had to be questioned because things don't move on unless you question them. So I'm torn because there's part of me that's very, I don't know, slightly suspect of the idea that suddenly poetry re-emerges after these hard, difficult times. I think it has to be what you're saying, though, Mike, I agree with, which is you have to understand that the poetry and the feeling can come through a myriad of operations on the surface of a painting.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
that is the way I would place it. But you've got to be sensitive to that process. You've got to get over the cliches, whether they be modernist cliches or
exactly, yeah.
you've got to get over them.
But we
to
can
see
we
the
can, we
reality
can, we
of
can,
it.
we can also place that understanding within certain kind of models that are existing in thinking around painting or contextual thinking around painting. Writers, for example, that we talked about earlier on, like Isabella Graw,
yeah.
who talks about the idea of the trace in painting being visible, or the author's trace being visible, but through a semiotic index. And that's quite a complex notion.
Yeah, and almost having like a temporal register that you can, through layers, and you can unpick something, and there's decision making, and it's very human. In other words, kind of tied in with emotion and
Yeah,
feeling.
there's
But
a certain...
actually,
I
think
get
people
it,
shirked
but
away from it
I
because
think
it's
as well, though,
complex.
it relies... And she talks a bit about the fetishization
Yeah.
of the mark making.
Yeah.
Like the owner, you're owning a bit of the artist.
Sure.
So, I think there's a duality there that I'm uncomfortable with. I will not
But
go
I
to
think
that
what-
space. Do you know
what
I
she
mean?
allows, John, is a space, I think, for artists now to actually reuse whatever gesture they may do. Now, it may be you working on Photoshop. It may be
Yeah.
you doing that gesture
Yeah.
with a paintbrush.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But that trace that painting holds of the author, she
Yeah.
feels is not sacrosanct, but very particular to painting historically.
Yeah.
And that's what
Yeah.
she's trying to promote.
Yeah.
So that trace becomes, regardless of whether it's flat or gestural,
Yeah.
becomes the site of expressivity. And that's not Greenbergian purity, that's not Greenbergian flatness per se, but it's a recognition that these theories have existed in order to give us a framework to frame what we can talk about now.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we don't have a sense of context.
They are the great difficulties. The way I like to frame at the moment is to use the word agency.
Yeah.
I like the idea that there's agency in what I'm doing.
Yeah.
There's a singularity. There's, but it's understanding that there are many, many singularities.
Could you explain to me what you mean by agency
Yeah,
exactly?
I was wondering. I think
Yeah, I know. I'm working on it. Yeah.
power, or is this kind of...
Well, it's a
There
relation.
there was something, talking about semiotics, there's a French semiotician and feminist art writer who talked about notions of singularity.
Right.
It was definitely to do with feminist art, and it was to do with art made
Is it
by
Rosalind
women.
Krauss?
Yeah. No, it wasn't.
Chantal Mouffe?
It's I can't remember off the top of my head. But the thing, what excited me about it was that she was prepared to explore the idea that one of painting's great attributes is its singularity.
Yes.
Yeah.
And then I guess that's what we're playing around here, isn't it?
Historically located, but
Yeah.
changed through the conditions of the now, perhaps. And the agency is that very change. It's where one recognizes the relationship between the thing made and its reception. So it's that
Yes.
recognition, that's where the agency lies. Between the sign and the signifier.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
signifier, perhaps,
Yeah.
in semiotic.
I read a beautiful quote the other day about
Terms.
thinking about this, the signifier and the signified as being on, that kind of classic thing of being on either side of the same sheet of paper. Kind of a beautiful idea,
Yeah.
where it's it can't be one without the other. And actually they're interchangeable. There's no such thing as a symbol or an icon or an index. Everything is kind of mixed in. Even that label on the bottle of water is probably three of them at the same time, different degrees. Without digressing too much, I wanted to ask you just something when you were both kind of touching on your own work. In particular, and I mean there are a few instances in this show where it's not exclusively abstract painting, but this idea of the expanded field, and this comes up a lot in painting discussions, but I think it's still quite important, and there's some misreadings on it, where both of you don't create a sort of, let's say, an easel painting per se. That can't be boiled down to that exclusively. And this is something that has emerged mostly out of, you could argue that, you could maybe argue some Richters are in the expanded field, but that's another discussion. But Do you sort of, how do you kind of think, do you intentionally, I'm sure maybe you don't intentionally work in the expanded field? Or?
I think the term is highly problematic, I have
Yeah.
to say. I think we use it very loosely because it's in fashion. And it also assumes, on the one hand, it's probably going against the argument a little bit generally, but assumes on the one hand that painting has this centrality in the visual arts, or the arts per se. A bit like Greenberg. Painting was his favourite art form, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It had the biggest history, so-called. And so when we say we expand from painting, what we're saying is painting has this greatness that other mediums don't have. I'm uncomfortable with that. I actually think that painting has always been expanded. It's been expanded especially since Malevich's Black Square, for example, which was the last painting ever to be made in 1919, apparently. You know, so the idea that something, you know, I mean, Robert Rauschenberg and Jasper Johns in the 50s with their combines on the paintings, I mean, that's expanded painting. So I think it's often a kind of term made up by museum directors and art critics to kind of like frame and sell another painting show. So it's a strange term, because I think we all kind of know that you can do what you like with painting, but for me always, my argument always is context, recognizing the context in which you come from historically and locally, and how you work with that.
I think the idea, though, and you know, it's in the show in many ways, is the idea of pressure. You're pressurizing painting. You know, the inversion of the quote. You know, the idea that painting can't be. It won't, on some level, even though it will be changed, it won't be. There's something consistent. Yet, we're throwing everything out. We're pressurizing it, and through that pressure, it changes. It evolves. That's the. So, my work it comes through a process of pressurizing.
Well, that gets back to your understanding, and I agree with this, of the singular, which is very desirable. You know, we often come to painting, don't we, when we go to art school, going, I want to be a painter, it's all about me. And actually, that kind of holds through all our activities, often as painters, but the me becomes maybe more expansive in terms of identity. You know, how we fix an identity on who we are, that we suddenly work out that the world is bigger than us. And I think that's maybe another way of thinking about expanded painting. You know, and thinking about where the subject is, the maker is. Where is the subjective? It's not spilling your guts and being all angsty.
Our identities are socially constructed, and perhaps meaning, that big word in painting, is also socially constructed. It's unless you literally make the painting and put it through a shredder straight afterwards, it's gonna be read in a myriad of ways. You're not totally in control.
And on a sort of dumb level, and I don't mean dumb stupid, I mean dumb kind of like knowing kind of stuff, and it's kind of experience really, is that I just really get off on being in a painting and trying things out with the materials and the framework that I've set myself. It's kind of fun.
I remember Gary Hume saying something in an interview years ago, and he said, I just like moving paint around a surface. And it just stuck with me. It was so simple. It was just, that is the central kind of core of what he likes to do.
But it's not enough, though.
I mean,
that's said with a huge amount of irony, I think. Because that would be great if we could all just sit there and say that. It would be fine. But that's not the state of how it is. That's
it comes with conditions, and the conditions are the things we talked about. But those conditions are flexible. You know. We know that. But it is that thing when I don't know about you, John, or you don't know, but when I'm in the studio, I don't think about these things we're talking about now.
You can't.
No,
You just,
I'm in a different zone.
It's like, it's like looking at the chessboard and going, oh, I got a great move, and you wake up in the morning and you go, I got a great move, I'm gonna make that great move, and you go in, and you go, But do you both kind of? I mean, I do this all the time, but kind of almost trick myself into making paintings. It sounds terrible, but it's really good fun. Sometimes, and you end up with something surprising.
But I do think that is the process, you know, like you were saying about the art school process of development. And I still think that as an individual, you have to go through those things. You have to make the mistakes. You have to force...
Through making.
Through making, exactly. That's the key to this.
And one of the
Yeah.
things that this is great, I don't know, you guys know Merleau-Ponty's Iron Mind. It's a really tough essay, but it's kind of interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, Merleau-Ponty was a phenomenologist, and this particular essay from 1960 talks about the idea of the body not being separated from the mind, which, of course, humanist Enlightenment thinking wants us to believe. And his big attack, or big target, is on the French thinker René Descartes, an Enlightenment philosopher who said it's the brain is separated from the body, and the brain is the power that drives everything, and everything you receive through the eye is translated through the brain. And Merleau-Ponty's reversing that. He's saying, no, it's the body that acts before your brain. So basically he's talking about action before thought, rather than thought before action. So that, we actually sort of do things like this. We're doodling in a studio. And then we go, oh. Like, for example, my favourite example to describe this more clearly is that imagine yourself walking down the street, okay? You don't say to your body, right, now I'm going to put my left foot in front of my right foot, move my arm behind. Now I'm going to move my right foot in front of my left foot, put the other arm in the other direction, and then I'm going to repeat that. You don't say that. Your body just does it. So his argument is that action becomes through thought. So this works against, the whole rational Enlightenment, scientific, the brain is above the body or separated from the body.
Yeah.
It has a very different function.
The idea of kind of disrupting back in terms of painting that kind of Cartesian perspectivalism, like the eye is the center that sort of almost like surveys and sort of absorbs, rather than thinking of this body is also in that space.
Yes.
There, this kind of that there is this. So I go back to the socially constructed thing that there's a. Or that kind of radio analogy, you are transmitting and you are transmitting.
And one of the things that's really interesting here, I mean, maybe I'm talking a little bit my own research area, but I do think it crosses over with all the other artists. We talk about it here a little bit. Digital representations. Where is our body and our subject in relation to the screen? Where is it? It's very different for those of us who have grown up prior to the screen and remember when they didn't exist. We were far more perhaps aware about the physical world around us. I don't know. I'd like to know what everyone thinks. But I think that for me it's a fascinating area of interest as to how the body and the subject relates to the physical making of something when we are bombarded by non-physical imagery. And that's a very interesting and curious interrelationship.
I mean, that's something, before I'll open up the questions in a second, but it's something I just wanted to ask you both, that I felt kind of walking around that a lot of the artists, and it feels like an element within their work, that recognizing that, we are kind of living in a sort of a digital world, and it is part of our daily experience. I mean, it gets said again and again and again, but if you really think about it, how if you could sort of tot up the amount of not just screen time, but just coming across screens and things you might read as screens. Did that impact? I mean, was that in the back of your minds when you're selecting artists, or or else artists that might say react to the screen?
Oh, definitely. I mean, you take an art like Mike, for instance. There's Selma Parler as well, who's very much involved in that. And we talked about it a little bit right at the beginning, which is a very difficult subject, which is the notion of representations of abstractions.
Yes, yeah.
And that space in painting, which is kind of fraught and seems to be, I think, an ongoing issue.
So can you explain what you mean by representations of abstraction?
I mean, say with Selma's work, she's very influenced by imagery of installations, let's say, of exhibitions, of modernist art. And then she might recreate these spaces, these ideal spaces for viewing art, as these strange quasi-architectural spaces in her paintings.
Yeah.
So they look like abstract things to me, but they are based in imagery. In something that was real at some point, or have become representations.
So there's like two steps removed from the object. There's a representation, then she represents.
And with your work, Mike, we have this mixture of languages, buried signs that are representations most of the time, but they're buried in a process of addition and subtraction.
Yeah.
So again, we're dealing with fraught, or well, not say fraught. I mean, it's mentioned in the press release, that word, which is it's one of them, isn't it? A little bit theatrical.
It's a seller.
but
It's a seller. You can't go wrong.
But that space is an interesting space. And I guess that.
But I think we're very aware. I think what the screen does is when you
explore in the show.
We have multiple platforms, don't we, that we work from with in and around the screen, and that multiplicity, the way we are in the world doing 1,001 things instantaneously, must somehow be reflected in painting.
It has to be.
It has to be.
Even actually, that's why I mentioned people who might turn their back on the screen in a way, because, and I've noticed this quite a bit with some painters that I've kind of spotted, where it's almost looks like, and thinking about the, what is it called, the Forever Now show that was in MoMA a couple of years ago. It's almost like turning your back on the now, but actually it doesn't, all it really does is focus back on. It's like you can't escape something of the screen, so it's painters having to deal with this maybe.
Or it becomes as you say, so then we get into the realms of a kind of repressed reality.
Yeah.
Of somehow, and that has its own strangeness and its peculiarities of existing outside of it. I guess there's always going to be that priest-like strangeness about turning your back on a particular world that you see infected by badness and finding solace in this creative journey that has somehow left all that behind. It seems to me that's always been there, but we seem to be now, all of these things seems to be heightened. The tensions seem to be heightened to a new degree, I think. And that's why that language of, that poetic language, that's why it always triggers alarm bells with me, because it's like being an unreconstructed modernist, which is a word, that we've thrown around a bit. It's almost like trying to back off from something you can't deal with, and to say, right, painting can't deal with this. It's not about painting. This isn't really and that is a real argument for a lot of people. So.
Just thought it might be a good chance to open up if anyone has any questions. Yep.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm really interested to hear your discussion. My field is theatre and performing arts, which is dance, drama and music. And I'm always being asked, what the hell is, what is your discipline doing these days? And I would like to ask you to try and articulate, what do you think the role of art is now in our situation? Where we have, potential Brexit and all that. What do you think your role actually is publicly?
Tough question.
God,
what do you
I
think?
wouldn't know where to start with that.
Maybe,
It's a manifesto, isn't it, really? But actually, just what does the art field think?
Okay, well, can I just?
How are you going to respond to it?
Well, okay, just from the heart. I have a need, a desire to make things. I have a need and a desire to work through what I see around me in the world. Picture the world. But I also recognize there's a framework of references that are both historically and contextually available to me through the language that I choose to use, which is painting. And I think that could apply to any medium, such as drama, dance, theatre, sculpture, television making, filmmaking. I think it's, and this is not a Greenbergian, reactionary return to the medium as medium specific, and you can only stick within the kind of languages of your own medium. On the contrary, actually, that recognizing that you do have these histories on these kind of things that are bigger than you, and contexts that are bigger than you, actually gives you the freedom, once you begin to understand them, to cross over disciplines, medium-wise, and that could be also then reflected in the way that you make the work about the world around you. Does that go some way to answering your question?
Somewhat.
Okay. Well, I don't know how to really answer the question, because it's a very big and interesting question.
Interested to know as artists
I think that's a very different... I mean, I'd love to talk about this, but I think that we have very limited time to talk about something political like that. Of course, we're all very aware of it. It's going to cut out, projects abroad. It may become very harmful for the arts. I don't know. We have to wait and see. But I really don't know how to answer that question until something actually happens.
I'd like to move on, but very quickly, I'd like to say that sometimes, though, getting back to the idea of a Marxist interpretation of history, these pressurized moments in history, these moments of instability, can create very powerful artistic output. Things change. Like, all the middle-tier galleries disappeared after the crash in London. There are artists now looking for shows, looking for different ways of making art and getting art shown in the world. And that's going to create a different way of thinking. Social media, what we've talked about, artists being able to connect with each other in lots of different ways than they could have done. The amount of information that we've managed to pull together to get this show done.
Even earlier on when I met Glenn Crosby, and I'd never met him before, but I've admired his work, mentioned his name, and he just came back from an exhibition opening yesterday, which I'd seen everything. I even saw the skylights. So it was this immediate, that couldn't have happened years ago. I would have been like...
You saw it online.
Saw it online, and I feel like I was there.
Yeah.
But it's just a different way of artists kind of connecting, I think it's great.
So, it's about you find your way through. That's the other thing. You keep going and you keep working. That's the only answer I can think of.
Any other questions from anybody?
There's one there.
Tony?
Yeah, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about use of the found object or the found object, basically. Like John and Michael use, Michael in the cave of me, you're making the work up from bits and elements like you find garments. I find really interesting about bits and pieces. So the things that I see that I've been walking on the street quite a lot. Maybe you could talk about some of the stuff that you make the work from.
Yeah, well, I think we both talked a little bit about pressurizing painting and bringing things into painting that necessarily in terms of structures and ideas about the hierarchy in painting shouldn't be there. And abstraction for me is the kind of fascinating, it has a dual reality because in a way, all the time we've been talking about abstract painting, we've failed to recognize that essentially abstract painting isn't about anything. Yet most of our discussion is about trying to force it into these relationships with new experience. And maybe there's something about abstract painting that connects to the qualities of experiences that you're talking about.
And also through objects.
And through objects.
So, for example, the objects... I'm sorry, I'm going to talk about myself here very briefly. The object that I've used, and I've never shown these objects publicly before on my paintings. So the wire, it's a Cat5 digital cable. It's there for a number of artistic reasons, formalist reasons, so colour, line, form, sculpture. But it's also there because of its cultural reference. It is what it is. So I'm asking the audience to make that cultural reference with the painting and perhaps think about digital referentiality with the painting. I mean, I've always sort of assumed it as an idea before, but maybe this is literalizing it a touch more. I don't know.
Yeah.
So it's a new experiment, and I've also been holding through surfaces and threading the Cat5 digicable through the holes. So the use of the object, for me, comes out of the discussion that we're having, and I'm pretty certain it's the same for you.
Yeah.
And I'm also thinking about Andrea Majacis-Jones' poll.
Yeah.
I think she would be nodding her head if she were here as well.
Yeah.
But you don't have to do these things in order to kind of make reference to the outside world or to this extended understanding of painting, because you take a painting by Claire Woods, for example, which is seriously brushy, but very knowingly brushy.
Yeah.
She knows that it's sort of risque to kind of be an expressive painter, but she does it in a really kind of, I think, perversely kind of not ironic, but perversely kind of offhand manner.
Yeah.
And
It's a real tightrope she's walking on.
Yeah, and I think it's a really fabulous game to play because the conditions allow for that.
I think Vicky Wright as well to write
Yeah,
really close
yeah.
to her work. I'd pick up on that. And her work as well.
Yeah. I think as well, I'm very interested in formality in painting and structure in painting. And I'm very interested in when objects disappear into a thing. When something becomes an identity of its own. So the shape of something. My work's very much because there's no frame, there's no rectangle, there's no essential window on the world or whatever you want to call it. You're dealing with a shape, but you're dealing with the objects that make up an identity. Yet the identity is a build-up of these fragments of materials. So
Fragments of materials of the real world.
Yes,
Yeah.
and I'm very interested in that tension between what becomes an abstract image, but it's being built of the fabric of the everyday. And it's interesting we talked about screens, we talked about software, but there's also the hardware. And I'm quite interested in how the modern day kind of detritus that you see of half bits of headphones and smashed CD cases and the new hardware that we all live with.
You're going to think about them as like stand-ins for some sort of maybe for something that you kind of make. Are they referencing something through painting, or do you want people to think of them as?
They couldn't exist without the history of painting. End of.
Yeah.
That's what I always say.
You don't think they would connect and make sense?
How do you mean?
Well, I'm thinking like in one sense, I mean, you've said, I'm not going to work in this rectangular frame.
Yeah.
I'm going to work on something else, which straight away sort of, if there's a couple of things which a painting must have, full ingredients, some sort of support surface, colour, something of the hand, whether it's abrasive or whether it's gestural, it's there. You've sort of, just by taking one away, but you've brought in the real world as well, which, the history of, I'm thinking of kind of the history of still life painting, where it was...
That's been important.
Very interesting still life paintings which would have used detritus
Yeah.
quite a lot.
And also the materials that a lot of the painters use, are also culturally referencing other things.
Yeah.
So, for example, Harlan Miller's bronze is very clearly referencing high art of the kind of modernist era. I'm thinking of Henry Moore, and cast bronzes.
And then minimalist sculpture.
And DJ Simpson, who uses a router tool, into the surface of his paintings, leaving the kind of the visibility of the layering of the wood underneath. And myself, who uses household paints and floor varnishes, which reference, decorators' materials, house painter materials. I mean, they're a part of the reading of the work.
Yeah. So as much that the material can sort of reference things outside, doesn't necessarily need to be this kind of notion of the expanded field is you could take that table and say that's a table as a painting. The word "as" is kind of being talked about earlier, it's kind of acting or playing or kind of playing a part. Which is it's kind of a simplistic way of looking at it, but I think what becomes quite interesting is where painting, when maybe photography came along, so then there was this kind of, it maybe lost one sort of function of likeness that it had. Of course, photography initially was black and white, so it didn't really. Video came along, what's painting going to do? But painting always seems to have, I think of it like sponge-like. It's always managed to, there's photography, we'll take a bit of that. We'll take a bit of, that's what video's doing, that's no problem, we'll take some of that. And it's kind of gone on, it's been like this, rather than painting kind of not just devouring its own history, it's also quite porous, I think, in a way.
But again, coming back to that original dichotomy about purity, about the medium, that medium is it, that is it. It must jettison everything else to be itself.
That's Greenberg.
Against this tidal wave
of other stuff
of
outside
other
itself.
stuff that's just there with it.
But I think it's a really great way of describing it. And also often when I'm talking to students, I always talk about the idea of being in your studio and in your head But actually, you know, you've got to think outside the studio and put yourself into someone else's head looking at you or looking at your work.
Yeah, absolutely.
You know, and I think that's a shift in thinking in the last 50 years.
I always think if, when talking to students, is what if someone was just walking off the street and look at what you did, what would they say? And they've just told, you know, a student might have talked about a certain thing, but what would it say? What would a lay person say in a way? And there's a great play that Piet Mondrian wrote called An Essay in Trialogue Form, and it's an abstract painter, a figurative painter, and what he terms a layman, so someone normal walking through a landscape, and they stop it over from morning till night at different things, and it's a really difficult to get book, but it's a play, but it's fantastic, and it's always the layman that seems to kind of settle things, settle the arguments. It's really great.
There we go.
Yeah, that's nice.
Is there any other questions for John or Michael?
There's one here.
Yes, Amy.
So it's for both of you, really. So when you were talking about language and semiotic through the object. Oh, sorry. Sorry, thank you.
Could you repeat from the start?
Yeah, sure. So the question's for both of you, and it's to do with like the language and semiotics and the objects that you choose. For example, John, your objects are found objects, everyday objects. With those objects, each individual has its own language, and I was just wondering is there not like what's the word? With all those languages from each of those objects, how do you combine them to fulfill that one idea, identity that you're trying to progress?
I guess it's about, I use the word formality. It's about the colour, the shape, the organisation, the structure, which is, for me, an inherently visual thing. So everything is shouting out from its own particular space, and is, as you say, it has its own significations. It's throwing stuff out at you. And what I like, the process I enjoy, is organising all those voices, if you like, into a sound, an organisation of that cacophony into something kind of, if I was going to push it, beautiful.
I think that's a very poetic way of putting the act of thinking and making visually. But it's predicated, surely, John, on form or formalism.
Yeah.
Which, of course, is a trope.
Yeah.
Perhaps a very restrictive trope,
Yes.
in modernist terms.
Yeah.
But by using that trope as a starting point, as a framework, you can bring this poetic stroke everydayness into the work to allow yourself to relax, to kind of just do stuff, muck about with stuff through form and colour.
Yeah.
Thank
Guess
you.
that's-
Thanks.
Dave has a question there.
Do you want me to come up and give it?
If I fall. With those objects, the compendium of objects that you're talking about, if it was myself, I would pick them, but would pick them and twist them and turn them to what I want from them, not necessarily their own narrative.
Yeah. Well, a lot of that goes on in the work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm thinking of John Chamberlain as well.
Yeah.
The way he manipulates metal in the
Yeah.
60s by painting on it or taking found car bonnets and screwing them around into sculpture.
Yeah.
So they act both as painting and sculpture, perhaps.
And the meaning or the reality, the physical reality of the individual objects is always changed by what's next to them.
Yes.
So that, they're always on the move in terms of nothing is ever on its own. There's always a relationship, even if it's with a wall as well as another object. There's always some kind of conversation going on between the elements. That's really important. It seems to encourage a sense of movement and stops a visual sense of stasis. Or
I think that also that's almost like how I've been thinking about the way that the show operates in a way that it is not one, it's sort of these different sort of positions. What abstract painting could or might be doing today.
Well, we actually see this as an extendable project, Jonathan.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
this just happened to be the kind of grouping that we thought would make some kind of contextual,
Yeah.
historical, popular cultural, painting
Yeah.
sense. But there's no reason why that couldn't be broken down into separate shows or indeed expanded with other artists.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, and I think that I'd like to think that the show kind of moves outside of itself because of that. So these are a number of individual positions within a wider framework.
Yeah.
Yes.
Can I just follow that? I just wondered when you were actually putting the show together, whether the positioning of the different works was challenging or natural, or what was the experience of that?
This is the thing. Me and Mike had a big meeting before the show. We sat down, we went through it, but you never know until you get in the damn place and you get the things out of the crates and suddenly you go, oh no! That, and it's that, but that's really exciting, and you find ways through it, and sometimes some of the initial instinctual points that we might have made, like listening to you were saying, one of the first conversations we had about where to put, say, Andrea's pole, it was sort of, and suddenly you had an idea for that went under the, just got swept away with everything else that we had to do. But when it came to the crunch, that was where it should be.
Yeah. So
You just don't know.
Are you actually saying that that's then an extension of the work that you've actually produced for the show, that the show is an extended form of that?
Yeah, and for me, it's really important that we get dynamic relationships between the objects and the paintings, so that so there are relationships going on, obviously, in the individual piece of work, but then there are bigger relationships going on between the paintings themselves.
And then the actual
objects
paintings, that kind of interconnectedness between them and the space that it's in itself,
Exactly.
and the city that's that.
Yeah.
It's like this kind of peels of an onion.
Yeah.
I always think about these
Yeah.
kind of in terms of how you might break down what that space over there means,
Yes.
might mean to people.
Yeah.
I think Louise
There
had
was
a
a
question
question,
there.
yeah. Can we just wait for the microphone, please?
Going back to the objects that you pick, is there a key element as to why you pick that object? Is it the colour of the object, the kind of shape of it, or the line of it, or the form? Is there anything that stands out more than anything else?
Yeah, I'd say more recent. I think it's more to do with the colour of an object. But again, as I said before, it's the relationship with something else. And colour is all about relationships.
But it's also
That's what it is.
there's also a cultural reference.
Yeah, and those
You're aware,
relationships.
so maybe you do the two things simultaneously.
Yeah.
Maybe you give yourself some kind of rule, John, like today I'm going to look for red stuff. Perhaps.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but the red stuff, but you're fine. What makes you distinguish one red object, found object, to another?
Yeah.
You think, well, actually, culturally, that doesn't make much sense for me, or I'm not interested in it. But
Yeah.
that does.
Yeah.
Perhaps.
Exactly. I mean, there's so many possibilities for the process to evolve, but that's what's exciting about it.
I was thinking about your use of the what did you call it? I thought it was an Ethernet cable, or what exactly is the
That's what it is, yeah.
an Ethernet cable? And it took me, when I was looking at your paintings during the week, it took me a while to see. I thought there was this kind of a repeated pattern, and then I started to read. Is it a Wi-Fi,
It's a Wi-Fi
symbol?
symbol.
And then I was in
Very
Tesco's
buried,
earlier, and
yeah.
I was using my contactless card, and I was like, there it is again.
Yeah.
And it was kind of, that painting wouldn't have made sense 10 years ago.
No, no one know what the sign was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That cable
Yeah.
would have been, I get what a cable is, but what's that thing at the end?
Yeah,
Maybe
yeah,
it might,
yeah.
is that an ISDN? Earlier versions. So I'm imagining that from seeing your work before, the kind of almost the Wi-Fi symbol, did that sort of lead to the object? And like you said, cables coming through the surface?
Yes, it did. I mean, I've always used signs and symbols, graphic signs and symbols,
Yeah.
in the work, but. And often I give myself a reason or a set of conditions or rules.
Yeah.
So, for example, I did a whole load of paintings that were based on vanitas imagery, like skulls, candles, books, from Dutch still life paintings. I used a series of letters and words from the word virus, which had some digital connotation for me. These are examples. But when I start to paint, those narrative connotations for me personally, disappear through the overlaying and overloading of the images. In fact, it's almost like fighting against the authority of the sign in the painting. So, so that then it becomes at the service, I should say, of form.
Yes.
And gesture and thinking through making, rather than, this, I'm supposed A sign equals B meaning equals C reference to history. I just chuck it all in the pot and see what happens.
And what I love about your approach, Mike, I think, is the physicality of the objects. When you're dealing with something with no physicality, it's amazing you end up with paintings that are full force physical entities.
They're very
have
much
a very strong sense of reality about them.
I think for all the paintings in the show,
objects.
there's very much a sense of physicality, somehow a reclaiming of the world of objects that we talked about earlier through Merleau-Ponty, perhaps.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a stretch too far, but certainly I do get this a lot when I'm in art schools, talking to students who are a bit fed up with the overload of digital culture at the moment. And many students I speak to really want to think physically. And I think that's a really interesting point, because I don't feel like a digital native, John, or maybe you don't. I don't know, but those people who are digital natives seem so fed up with expressing themselves online through Instagram or whatever, that somehow there may be some kind of not reaction against it, but like just a willingness or a desire to think about, reconnect with the physical, perhaps. And I think that's one of the things that painting can do in the 21st century.
It's more than just, like we talked a little bit about, like almost like digital, like maxtraction, this kind of terrible term that's there, but you can see what they mean, this kind of gesture on the phone or gesture on Photoshop, and the kind of Laura, I don't want to say Laura Owens because she's moved on from that really, but it's the kind of the grid and that's there. But actually, you do see, I'm thinking of, is it Paul Housley, kind of someone who's kind of returning, or not returning, but kind of just saying, I'm going to make a painting of this matchbox, or this this kind of clay thing fuddled together, and it's going to be really small, and it's just going to be elegant, and they're fantastic, but maybe they wouldn't have seemed so fantastic. It's to go back to this context thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
It makes the work. It makes it, or it breaks
But that's
it.
a really interesting paradox, and it does bring us back to this idea of somehow reclaiming a space for action, agency, all those things that maybe, when you're working with a phone, you're being guided through everything. Everything's sorted out for you.
Circumscribed before you pick it up, isn't it?
False sense.
And you're given this kind of device saying, hey, you've got complete freedom. That's what the provider tells you. And of course, you're being watched, and secondly, it's only got selective memory, and it can only do certain actions. Like, can it do that? Do that? No, it can't. So it's a strange paradox. But I digress. I think there was another question actually somewhere.
Is there maybe one last question before?
Before you were talking about an artistic language and the layperson, is the artistic language more personal, or is it a global language? And how would a layperson interpret that if they don't understand that language?
That's a great question.
Can I just use the C word again? Does anyone remember what the C word is?
Hope you don't mean
context.
Context.
It's my bad joke, I'm sorry. Context. I mean, the layperson, when a member of the public goes into a gallery, they know they're going to experience art. Okay? If they don't want to experience art, don't go to the gallery. So it's a question of wanting to take part in the experience of the context. Now, you may go to the gallery and say, I'm going to go to the gallery, but I'm going to really disrespect this show. You're going to go to look for an argument, but that's positive. So I think it's a question of not excluding the so-called layperson, but just if anyone wants to any member of the public wants to go and see an exhibition, there are hundreds of them, thousands of them out there. But, you know, that you accept the context. You walk into a space and you say, I know I'm entering a gallery, and this person, whoever is showing here, is asking me to take this seriously and perhaps ask questions. So that's the only way I can answer a question like that. If that's okay. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
Good. And you all thought I was going to swear. Pathetic.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank John and Michael very much for putting together the show. I'd like to say huge thanks to Tony Smith, who's been doing amazing work behind the scenes in putting the show together, and to Professor Simon Piasecki for helping put together the festival. And thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Donal.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Thank you.